The frozen ground cracked beneath Jake Mitchell's boots as he approached the weathered fence post where his brother's hat hung like a silent accusation. 6 months had passed since David's funeral. Yet Jake couldn't bring himself to touch the worn Stetson that swayed gently in the bitter Montana wind. Each morning, he walked the same path through the snow-covered pastures of Broken Arrow Ranch, and each morning, the hat reminded him of the promise he'd made and the desire he couldn't silence. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Inside the ranch house, warm light glowed against the endless white landscape. Through the kitchen window, he could see Emma moving about, her auburn hair catching the lamplight as she prepared breakfast for her 4-year-old son Tommy. She moved with quiet grace, despite the weight of widowhood that had settled on her shoulders like an invisible shawl. Jake watched her pour milk into a small blue cup, the same cup David had bought for Tommy's 3rd birthday, and felt the familiar twist of guilt and longing that had become his constant companion. The ranch was dying around them. Cattle stood huddled against the wind, their breath forming clouds in the sub-zero air, while unpaid bills accumulated on David's old desk like autumn leaves. The bank had given them 60 days, and 43 had already slipped away like water through cupped hands. Jake knew he should walk away, leave Emma to start fresh somewhere else, but every time he tried to convince himself to go, Tommy's laughter would echo across the yard, or Emma would look at him with those green eyes that held equal measures of gratitude and something deeper, something that made his chest tight with possibilities he had no right to consider. Jake pulled his wool collar higher against the wind and turned away from the hat that haunted his daily routine. The Broken Arrow Ranch stretched out before him in all directions. 500 acres of Montana wilderness that had been in the Mitchell family for 3 generations. His grandfather had built the main house from local timber. His father had added the barn and bunkhouse, and David had dreamed of expanding into organic beef production. Now the dream sat frozen in time, like everything else since that terrible April morning when Jake's absence had cost his brother everything. The snow crunched beneath his boots as he made his way toward the barn, where the sounds of cattle moving restlessly in their stalls created a familiar symphony of need. 27 head of Black Angus remained from what had once been a herd of over 100. They'd had to sell most of the cattle to pay for David's medical bills and funeral expenses, leaving barely enough to maintain the ranch's breeding program. Each animal represented hope and financial strain in equal measure. Jake pushed open the heavy barn door, and the smell of hay and warm animal bodies enveloped him like a memory. The cattle turned toward him expectantly, their large eyes reflecting the dim light filtering through ice-covered windows. He'd been doing this work since he was Tommy's age, learning the rhythm of ranch life from his father and later from David, who had always been the responsible one, the one with plans and vision, and the steady hands needed to build something lasting. Moving through his morning routine with practiced efficiency, Jake distributed hay and checked the water systems that constantly threatened to freeze in the brutal Montana winter. The work provided a temporary escape from the thoughts that circled his mind like wolves. But as he worked, he could hear sounds from the house carried on the wind. Emma's voice calling Tommy to breakfast, the little boy's excited chatter about the snow fort they'd planned to build, the domestic harmony that Jake longed to be part of, and felt guilty for wanting. When David was alive, Jake had been the ranch foreman, the younger brother who handled the day-to-day operations while David managed the business side and spent evenings with his family. It had been a comfortable arrangement, one that allowed Jake to avoid the complications of marriage and parenthood, while still being part of something meaningful. He'd lived in the bunkhouse, ate dinner with the family most nights, and played the role of favorite uncle to Tommy with genuine affection and no sense of the responsibility that came with being a father figure. Everything had changed on that April morning when David called asking for help with a particularly difficult bull they were moving to a different pasture. Jake had been in town, 3 drinks into what was supposed to be just 1 beer after a hard week of calving season. He'd promised David he'd be there in an hour, but the whiskey and the company of Sarah Martinez from the feed store had made time slip away like smoke. By the time Jake made it back to the ranch, the ambulance was already pulling away, and David was already gone. The bull had charged unexpectedly, catching David alone in the pen. The coroner said death had been instantaneous, a small mercy that did nothing to ease Jake's guilt. If he'd been there, if he'd kept his promise, David would still be alive. Emma would still have her husband, Tommy would still have his father, and Jake wouldn't wake up every morning with the taste of regret sharp in his mouth like copper pennies. Finishing with the cattle, Jake stepped back outside into the biting wind. The house windows glowed invitingly, and he could see Emma moving around the kitchen while Tommy sat at the table, probably playing with his toy trucks while he ate. The scene pulled at something deep in Jake's chest, a longing for belonging that he'd never fully acknowledged when David was alive. Now with his brother gone, and Emma struggling to hold everything together, that longing had transformed into something more complex and infinitely more dangerous. He knew he should leave. Had known it for months. Emma was young and beautiful and deserved a chance to build a new life without the constant reminder of what she'd lost. Tommy needed stability and a fresh start, not an uncle wrestling with inappropriate feeling and crushing guilt. But every time Jake tried to pack his few belongings and head for another ranch in another state, Emma would ask him to fix something, or Tommy would run to him with scraped knee, or the financial crisis would deepen another degree, and Jake would find another reason to stay just one more week. The kitchen door opened, and Emma appeared on the porch, her breath creating small clouds in the frigid air. She wore David's old ranch coat over her dress, the heavy canvas hanging loose on her smaller frame. The sight of her in his brother's clothes sent a fresh wave of guilt through Jake's system, followed immediately by awareness of how beautiful she looked with her cheeks flushed from the warmth of the house and her hair escaping from its ponytail in soft tendrils. "Jake," she called, her voice carrying clearly in the still air. "Breakfast is ready, and Doc Henderson is coming by this morning to check on the pregnant heifer." He nodded and started toward the house, his boots creating a steady rhythm on the packed snow path that David had shoveled every morning for 5 years. As he approached the porch, Emma stepped back to let him pass, and for a moment they were close enough that he could smell the faint scent of vanilla and soap that seemed to follow her. The proximity made his pulse quicken in a way that felt like betrayal. Inside the warm kitchen, Tommy looked up from his breakfast with a grin that was pure David, all enthusiasm and mischief. "Uncle Jake," he announced through a mouthful of pancakes. "Mama says we can build this." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Snowford after chores if the wind dies down. "That's right, buddy," Jake replied, ruffling the boy's dark hair as he passed. "But first we need to make sure all the animals are happy and warm." Emma poured coffee into a heavy ceramic mug and set it at Jake's usual place at the table. The routine had developed gradually over the months since the funeral, small acts of domestic comfort that felt both natural and charged with unspoken meaning. She'd stopped setting a place for David at the head of the table sometime in October, but she still wore her wedding ring and still spoke of David in the present tense when she talked to Tommy about his father. The coffee was strong and black, exactly how Jake liked it, though he'd never told Emma his preference. She seemed to notice things like that, small details about his habits and needs that made him feel cared for in ways he'd never experienced. David had been lucky to find her, a kindergarten teacher from Billings who'd fallen in love with ranch life as much as she'd fallen in love with his brother. She'd adapted to the isolation and hard work with remarkable grace, learning to drive the tractor, help with calving season, and create a home that felt warm and welcoming despite the harsh landscape surrounding it. Doc Henderson's truck appeared in the distance, a red speck against the white expanse moving steadily toward the ranch. Sarah Henderson was both the local veterinarian and the closest thing the Mitchell family had to a confidant. She delivered most of the calves on the ranch, patched up countless injuries to both animals and humans, and had been David's friend since childhood. If anyone understood the complicated dynamics now governing life at Broken Arrow Ranch, it was Doc Henderson. Jake finished his breakfast quickly and headed back outside to meet the veterinarian, grateful for any distraction from the domestic intimacy of the kitchen. The pregnant heifer had been showing signs of distress for the past few days, and they couldn't afford to lose either the cow or her calf. Every animal on the ranch represented both financial necessity and emotional investment, connections to the life David had been building that Jake now felt responsible for preserving. Doc Henderson climbed out of her truck, carrying the black bag that had become a familiar sight around the ranch over the years. She was a woman in her 50s with gray-streaked hair and hands that moved with confident competence, whether she was examining a horse or stitching up a rancher who'd tangled with barbed wire. Her presence always brought a sense of calm capability that Jake found reassuring. "Morning, Jake," she said, her breath forming clouds as she spoke. "How's our mama cow doing today?" "Still restless," Jake replied, leading her toward the barn where the heifer stood apart from the other cattle. "Been pacing most of the night, according to Emma." Doc Henderson raised an eyebrow at the casual reference to Emma's nighttime observations. But she didn't comment directly. Instead, she began her examination of the heifer with practiced thoroughness, her movements sure and gentle despite the animal's obvious discomfort. Jake watched her work, appreciating the way she spoke softly to the cow while her hands assessed the situation. "She's close," Doc Henderson said after several minutes of examination. "Should drop that calf within the next day or two. Everything looks normal, but keep an eye on her. First-time mothers can be unpredictable." Jake nodded, filing the information away with the dozens of other details that comprised daily ranch management. Doc Henderson packed her equipment back into the bag, but she didn't head immediately toward her truck. Instead, she leaned against the barn wall and studied Jake with the directness that made her such an effective veterinarian and such an uncomfortable companion when personal topics arose. "How are things really going, Jake?" she asked, her tone gentle but insistent. "With the ranch, with Emma and Tommy, with you?" The question hung in the cold air between them like a challenge. Jake could give her the surface answer, talk about cattle prices and weather conditions, and the ongoing financial struggles that kept him awake at night. But Doc Henderson had known him since he was Tommy's age, had witnessed the complicated dynamics of the Mitchell family through good times and bad, and she had a way of seeing through convenient half-truths. "We're managing," Jake said finally, the words feeling inadequate even as he spoke them. "That's not what I asked," Doc Henderson replied. She pulled off her work gloves and tucked them into her coat pocket. "I've been watching this family for 30 years, Jake. I delivered you and David both, helped your father through your mother's cancer, celebrated David's wedding and Tommy's birth. I know the difference between managing and thriving." Jake kicked at a clump of frozen dirt, buying time while he tried to formulate a response that wouldn't reveal too much. The problem was that Doc Henderson already knew too much, had probably guessed at the feelings he was trying so hard to suppress. In a community as small as Cedar Falls, secrets were difficult to keep, and emotions were even harder to hide. "The ranch is in trouble," Jake admitted. "Real trouble. Frank Garrett at the bank has been patient, but patience doesn't last forever when money's involved." "And Emma?" Doc Henderson asked quietly. "Emma is stronger than anyone has a right to be," Jake said, and he meant it. "She's holding everything together when most people would have fallen apart months ago." "That's still not what I asked." Jake met her eyes directly for the first time since the conversation began. The honesty he saw there was both comforting and terrifying. Doc Henderson had a reputation for speaking truth even when truth was painful, and he sensed she was building up to something he wasn't ready to hear. "Emma is David's widow," Jake said carefully. "She's my brother's wife, and Tommy's mother, and someone I'm trying to help through a difficult time. That's all." Doc Henderson studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right," she said. "But Jake, when you figure out that it's not all, when you realize that life is messy and complicated, and that good people sometimes find themselves in impossible situations, remember that David would want his family to be happy. All of his family." She climbed into her truck and started the engine, but she rolled down the window before pulling away. "The heifer should be fine," she called over the sound of the motor. "But call me if anything changes. And Jake, that goes for everything else too." The truck disappeared down the long driveway, leaving Jake alone with thoughts he'd been trying to avoid for months. Doc Henderson's words echoed in his mind as he returned to the barn to check on the pregnant heifer. The animal looked up at him with large, patient eyes, and he found himself wondering if she understood the complexity of the situation she was in, carrying life while surrounded by uncertainty. Back at the house, he could hear Emma and Tommy laughing about something, their voices carrying through the walls like music. The sound made him smile despite his complicated emotions, and he realized that Doc Henderson was right about one thing: David would want his family to be happy. The question that Jake couldn't answer was whether his presence at Broken Arrow Ranch was helping or hindering that happiness. Part 2. Memories in the Attic. The following morning brought news that changed everything. Frank Garrett's black sedan pulled up the ranch driveway just as Jake finished his second cup of coffee, the banker's pristine vehicle looking out of place against the rugged landscape. Through the kitchen window, Jake watched the man emerge wearing a charcoal suit that probably cost more than most ranchers made in a month. Frank's expression carried the practiced neutrality of someone who delivered bad news for a living. Emma noticed Jake's tension immediately. Her hand paused over Tommy's plate as she followed his gaze to the approaching figure. The color drained from her face, leaving her looking fragile in the morning light that streamed through the frost-covered windows. Tommy continued eating his oatmeal, oblivious to the adult anxiety crackling through the air like electricity before a thunderstorm. "I'll handle this," Jake said, rising from the table with deliberate calm. He could feel Emma's eyes following him as he pulled on his coat and stepped onto the porch, closing the door firmly behind him to shield Tommy from whatever conversation was about to unfold. Frank Garrett climbed the porch steps with the measured pace of a man who controlled the timing of every interaction. His leather briefcase gleamed despite the harsh winter conditions, and his shoes had been polished to mirror brightness that reflected the snow-covered yard. Everything about him spoke of comfort and success, a stark contrast to the weathered ranch house and the man who defended it. "Jake," Frank said, extending a gloved hand that Jake ignored. "I hoped we could discuss the Mitchell account privately." "Nothing about this ranch is private from Emma," Jake replied. "She owns it now." Frank's smile remained fixed, but something calculating flickered behind his eyes. "Actually, that's one of the complications we need to address. The mortgage was in David's name exclusively. Emma has certain rights as surviving spouse, but the legal situation is more complex than she might realize." Jake felt something cold settle in his stomach that had nothing to do with the Montana winter. "What exactly are you saying, Frank?" "I'm saying that the bank has been exceptionally patient given the circumstances. We've deferred payments for 6 months out of respect for the family's grief. But business is business, and we have obligations to our shareholders and depositors." Frank opened his briefcase and withdrew a manila folder thick with official-looking documents. "The ranch is currently 3 months behind on mortgage payments. The total amount due, including penalties and accumulated interest, is $47,000. Without payment in full within 30 days, we'll have no choice but to initiate foreclosure proceedings." The number hit Jake like a physical blow. He'd known the financial situation was serious, but seeing it reduced to precise figures made the crisis feel suddenly real and immediate. $47,000 might as well have been $47 million given their current resources. "There has to be another option," Jake said, working to keep his voice level. "The ranch has been in the Mitchell family for 3 generations. David was building something here." Frank's expression softened slightly, though whether from genuine sympathy or practiced manipulation was impossible to determine. "Jake, I understand the emotional attachment. I really do. But sentiment doesn't pay mortgages. However, I do have a proposition that might interest you." He reached into the briefcase again and produced a second folder, this one containing what appeared to be a real estate contract. "Mountain Vista Development has been looking for ranch properties in this area for their new luxury resort project. They've authorized me to make a substantial offer for Broken Arrow Ranch." Jake took the contract with reluctant hands, scanning the numbers that seemed to swim before his eyes. The offer was indeed substantial, enough to pay off the mortgage and provide Emma with a comfortable nest egg for starting over somewhere else. It was also the death of everything David had worked to build. This would mean selling to developers, Jake said, looking up from the papers. Turning ranch land into vacation homes for rich folks from California. Frank shrugged with practiced indifference. Progress is inevitable, Jake. This area is going to develop whether the Mitchell family participates or not. At least this way, Emma and Tommy benefit financially from the transition. The porch door opened quietly, and Emma stepped outside wearing David's heavy coat. Her green eyes moved between the two men, reading the tension with the accuracy of someone who'd learned to interpret adult conversations for survival. Tommy appeared behind her, his small face peering around her legs with curiosity. "What's happening?" Emma asked, her voice steady, despite the worry evident in her posture. Frank turned toward her with the same practiced smile he'd offered Jake. "Mrs. Mitchell, I was just explaining the bank's position regarding your mortgage situation. I know this is difficult, but I'm here to help you explore all available options." Emma's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She stepped forward and held out her hand for the contract Jake was holding. Her fingers brushed his as she took the papers, and he felt the slight tremor she was trying to conceal. For several minutes, she read in silence while Tommy grew restless beside her, and Frank checked his expensive watch. "This is David's ranch," Emma said finally, handing the contract back to Frank without looking at the signature line. "His father built the house I'm standing in. His grandfather cleared the land where my son plays. You're asking me to sell my husband's dream to build vacation homes." Frank's expression remained professionally sympathetic. "Mrs. Mitchell, I understand your emotional connection to this property. But dreams don't pay bills. You have a young son to consider, a future to plan. This offer would give you the financial security to start fresh anywhere you choose." Emma looked at Jake, and he saw something in her eyes that made his chest tight with admiration and something deeper. There was steel beneath her grief, a strength that David had recognized and loved. She wasn't going to be bullied into abandoning everything her husband had worked for, regardless of the financial pressure. "How long do we have?" she asked Frank directly. 30 days for full payment of the arrears," Frank replied, closing his briefcase with a definitive snap. "After that, foreclosure proceedings begin automatically. However, the development offer remains open for 60 days, which gives you time to consider your options carefully." After Frank's sedan disappeared down the driveway, Jake and Emma stood in silence on the porch, while Tommy built a miniature snowman from the snow that had accumulated on the railing. The weight of their situation settled around them like a heavy blanket, pressing down with suffocating reality. $47,000, Emma said quietly, her voice carrying a note of disbelief. Jake nodded, unable to find words that would make the situation less overwhelming. The amount represented more money than the ranch typically generated in 2 good years, and they'd already sold most of their cattle to cover David's medical expenses and funeral costs. Emma turned toward him suddenly, her green eyes bright with unshed tears and determination. "Jake, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." He waited, sensing that whatever she was about to say would change something fundamental between them. "Are you staying because you feel guilty about David, or are you staying because you want to be here with us?" The question cut through every careful rationalization he'd constructed over the past 6 months. Emma deserved honesty, but the truth was complicated and dangerous, and could destroy the fragile stability they'd built together. Jake looked at Tommy, who was chattering happily to his snowman, and felt the familiar weight of responsibility and desire pressing against his chest. "Both," Jake said finally. "I can't separate the two anymore." Emma nodded, as if his answer confirmed something she'd suspected. "That's what I thought." She picked up Tommy and balanced him on her hip. "We need to go through David's papers more thoroughly. There might be something we missed, some asset or insurance policy that could help." They spent the afternoon in David's study, a small room off the main hallway that had served as the ranch's business center. Emma sat on the floor surrounded by file folders and ledger books, while Jake examined the contents of David's desk drawers. Tommy played quietly in the corner with a set of wooden blocks that David had carved for his second birthday. The paperwork told the story of a man who'd been trying to build something lasting despite constant financial pressure. David had researched organic certification, investigated direct-to-consumer beef sales, and explored partnerships with local restaurants. His plans were detailed and optimistic, but they required capital investment that had never materialized. "Look at this," Emma said, holding up a leather-bound journal. "It's David's planning notes for the organic transition. He calculated that we could increase profit margins by 60% within 3 years, if we could afford the certification process and initial infrastructure costs." Jake took the journal and flipped through pages covered with David's careful handwriting. His brother had been thorough, researching every aspect of the transition from traditional ranching to organic beef production. The numbers were encouraging, but they highlighted the cruel irony of their situation. David had identified a path to financial stability, but implementing his plan required exactly the kind of money they didn't have. "There's something else," Emma said, her voice carrying a note of excitement that made Jake look up from the journal. Hidden behind the filing cabinet, she'd found a manila envelope sealed with wax that bore David's handwriting. For Emma and Jake to be opened together. They stared at the envelope for several seconds, neither wanting to be the first to break the seal that David had placed there. Finally, Emma picked it up and carefully worked the wax loose with her fingernail. Inside were 3 items: a letter addressed to both of them, a second sealed envelope marked insurance documents, and a small key attached to a leather cord. Emma unfolded the letter with trembling hands, while Jake moved closer so they could read together. David's familiar handwriting covered 2 pages of ranch stationery. "Emma and Jake, if you're reading this, then something has happened to me, and you're trying to figure out how to save the ranch. I hope you never have to open this envelope, but I wanted to make sure you had options if the worst happened. First, the insurance policy in the sealed envelope is separate from my regular life insurance. It's a special agricultural policy that covers ranching accidents with a survivor benefit of $50,000. The premium was expensive, but I thought it was worth the peace of mind. Maria Santos helped me set it up through her husband's insurance agency in Billings. Second, the key opens a safety deposit box at First National Bank in Cedar Falls. Box number 247. Inside you'll find my grandfather's silver dollars, my father's savings bonds, and some other items that might help bridge the financial gap while you implement the organic transition plan. Jake, I know you blame yourself for whatever happened to me. Stop it. You've been the best brother and business partner a man could ask for. Emma and Tommy need you now more than they need my memory. Take care of them, but more than that, let them take care of you. You deserve happiness, and so do they. Emma, you made me feel like the luckiest man alive every single day of our marriage. I hope you'll remember the good times more than the sad ones. Jake loves you and Tommy almost as much as I do. If something grows between you two, don't let guilt or what other people might think stop you from being happy. Life is too short and too precious to waste on what-ifs. The ranch can survive this crisis if you work together. But more importantly, you can build something new and strong if you're brave enough to try. I love you both. David. The letter fell from Emma's hands as she began to cry. Not the quiet tears she'd shed in private over the past months, but deep, wrenching sobs that seemed to come from somewhere she'd kept carefully locked away. Jake reached for her instinctively, and she turned into his arms without hesitation, her face pressed against his chest while her body shook with grief and relief, and something else that neither of them was ready to name. Tommy looked up from his blocks with concern, not understanding why his mother was crying but sensing that something important was happening. Jake held Emma while she wept, one hand stroking her hair and the other resting protectively on her back. The embrace felt natural and right, despite the complicated emotions swirling around them. When Emma's tears finally subsided, she pulled back enough to look at Jake directly. Her eyes were red but determined, and he could see that something fundamental had shifted in her perspective. "David knew," she said softly. "He knew how you felt, and he gave us permission." Jake felt something break loose inside his chest, some knot of guilt and self-denial that had been choking him for months. David's words had been clear and deliberate. A blessing from beyond the grave that acknowledged feelings Jake had been afraid to examine too closely. "We need to go to the bank," Emma said, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "Tomorrow morning, first thing. If David was right about the insurance and the safety deposit box, we might have enough to save the ranch." That evening, after Tommy had been put to bed with extra stories and cuddles, Jake and Emma sat in the living room before the fireplace. David's letter spread on the coffee table between them like a bridge connecting their separate islands of grief and uncertainty. The flames cast dancing shadows on the walls while wind rattled the windows, but inside the house felt warmer than it had in months. Emma had changed into jeans and one of David's old flannel shirts, the sleeves rolled up to accommodate her smaller frame. The sight of her in his brother's clothes no longer sent spikes of guilt through Jake's system. Instead, he saw it for what it was, a woman making practical choices about warmth and comfort while navigating an impossible situation. "I've been thinking about what David wrote," Emma said, her voice carefully neutral, "about not letting guilt stop us from being happy." Jake nodded, not trusting himself to speak. The conversation they were approaching felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, looking down into depths that might contain either salvation or destruction. "I loved David," Emma continued, her eyes focused on the fire rather than Jake's face. "I loved him completely, and I'll never regret our marriage or wish it hadn't happened. But he's gone, and I'm still here, and Tommy needs stability more than he needs me to be a memorial to his father." She turned toward Jake then, and the firelight caught the gold flecks in her green eyes. "You've been taking care of us for 6 months without asking for anything in return. You've put your own life on hold to help us through the worst time imaginable. That's not guilt, Jake. That's love." The word hung in the air between them like a challenge. Jake felt his heart racing as he looked at Emma, this strong, beautiful woman who'd somehow seen past his self-imposed barriers to the feelings he'd been afraid to acknowledge. She was right about love, but she was also right about guilt, and the two emotions had become so tangled together that he couldn't separate them anymore. "I don't want to be David's replacement," Jake said finally. "I don't want you to choose me because I'm convenient or safe, or because Tommy already knows me." Emma smiled then, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her since before David's accident. "That's not why I'd choose you," she said softly. "I'd choose you because when I wake up in the middle of the night, worried about the ranch or Tommy's future, you're the person I want to talk to. I'd choose you because you make me laugh, even when everything seems impossible. I'd choose you because after 6 months of grief and fear, you make me feel alive again." Jake reached for her hands, marveling at how perfectly they fit in his own. Emma's skin was soft despite the ranch work, and he could feel the calluses she'd developed from learning to handle tools and equipment that David had once managed. These were the hands of a woman who'd refused to give up, who'd fought for her son's inheritance and her husband's dreams even when the odds seemed impossible. Part 3. Revelations at the Bank. The next morning dawned clear and cold, with the kind of brilliant blue sky that made the snow-covered landscape look like a Christmas card. Jake and Emma left Tommy with Maria Santos, their nearest neighbor, explaining only that they had business in town. Maria's knowing glance suggested she suspected more than they were saying, but she simply nodded and promised to keep Tommy entertained with her own grandchildren. The drive to Cedar Falls took them through countryside that looked deceptively peaceful under its blanket of snow. The rolling hills hid the struggles of dozens of ranch families facing similar financial pressures, each one fighting to preserve a way of life that seemed increasingly incompatible with modern economic realities. Jake drove while Emma sat quietly beside him, the sealed insurance envelope and David's key clutched in her hands, like talismans. First National Bank occupied a corner building on Main Street, its red brick facade and white columns suggesting permanence and stability that felt reassuring given their circumstances. Inside, the lobby was warm and professionally decorated, with photographs of local ranching families and agricultural scenes that celebrated the community's heritage. The insurance agent who met them was a compact man in his 50s named Robert Chen, Maria Santos' brother-in-law, and someone who'd known David since high school. His expression was professionally sympathetic as Emma explained their situation and presented the sealed envelope containing the agricultural accident policy. Robert examined the documents with careful attention, occasionally making notes on a legal pad or consulting his computer screen. The process seemed to take forever, each minute stretching like an hour, while Jake and Emma waited to learn whether David's foresight would provide the salvation they desperately needed. Finally, Robert looked up with something approaching a smile. "The policy is valid and current," he said. David was very specific about the coverage parameters. "The benefit amount is $50,000, payable upon submission of death certificate and proof of accidental death during ranching operations." Emma's hand found Jake's underneath the table, her fingers intertwining with his in a grip that was equal parts relief and desperation. $50,000 wouldn't solve all their problems, but combined with whatever David had stored in the safety deposit box, it might provide enough breathing room to implement his organic transition plan. "The paperwork will take a few days to process," Robert continued, "but I can advance you a portion of the funds immediately if you need them for urgent expenses. Let's say $20,000 by tomorrow morning." After leaving the insurance office, Jake and Emma walked the 3 blocks to the safety deposit box vault in the basement of First National Bank. The key David had left them opened box 247, a narrow metal drawer that contained treasures their desperate imagination had probably overestimated. Inside, they found a collection of silver dollars that Jake's grandfather had been accumulating since the 1940s, several Series E savings bonds that David's father had purchased during the 1960s, and a manila envelope containing photographs and documents they'd never seen before. The silver coins were valuable, and the savings bonds had matured to significant amounts, but the real treasure was in the envelope. The photographs showed Broken Arrow Ranch during its early days, when Jake and David's grandfather had first established the cattle operation. There were pictures of prize-winning bulls, family gatherings during roundups, and several images of a younger version of the main house before various additions and renovations. But it was the documents that made Emma gasp with surprise. David's grandfather had apparently been more business-savvy than anyone realized. Among the papers was a mineral rights lease from the 1950s that had never been fully explored, a water rights agreement that established Broken Arrow Ranch's legal claim to the Cedar River tributary running through their property, and most surprisingly, a letter from the Montana Historical Society, expressing interest in designating portions of the ranch as historically significant due to Native American artifacts found on the property. "This changes everything," Emma said, studying the Historical Society letter dated just 2 months before David's death. "If the ranch has historical significance, it might be protected from development. And these water rights, Jake, do you realize how valuable these are?" Jake examined the water rights document with growing amazement. In Montana, water rights were often more valuable than the land itself, and the agreement his grandfather had negotiated gave Broken Arrow Ranch exclusive use of the tributary for agricultural purposes. Any development in the area would need to negotiate water access, giving them leverage they hadn't known existed. "We need to call the Historical Society," Emma continued, her excitement growing as the implications became clear. "And we should contact the State Agricultural Extension Office about the mineral rights." David might have been sitting on resources he never knew he had. The drive back to the ranch felt different from the morning journey. Instead of desperate hope, they carried concrete possibilities, and the beginnings of a plan that might preserve David's legacy while securing Tommy's future. Emma sat closer to Jake in the truck's cab, their earlier conversation creating a new intimacy that felt both natural and slightly dangerous. Tommy ran to greet them when they arrived at Maria's house, his face flushed with excitement from playing in the snow with her grandchildren. He chattered about the snow fort they'd built, and the snowball fight that had ended with everyone laughing and covered in snow. Watching him, Jake felt a fierce protectiveness that went beyond his role as uncle. Maria Santos was a woman in her 60s with silver hair and eyes that missed nothing. She'd been ranching with her husband for over 30 years, raising 5 children while managing cattle and dealing with the same economic pressures facing the Mitchell family. Her experience with hardship made her both sympathetic and practical. "You two look like you've had some good news," she observed, pouring coffee while Tommy showed Emma the cookies he'd helped bake. Whatever you found in town seems to have put some hope back in your eyes. Emma glanced at Jake before answering. We found some things of David's that we didn't know existed. Insurance money, family documents, things that might help us save the ranch. Maria nodded approvingly. David was always thorough about planning, even when he was young. I remember when he researched cattle breeds for 6 months before buying his first bull. If he left you information, it was because he thought carefully about what you'd need. She paused in her coffee pouring and fixed Jake with a direct look. And Jake, it's about time you stopped punishing yourself for something that wasn't your fault. David wouldn't want you carrying guilt that belongs to no one. Part 4. Growing Connections. The following weeks brought a flurry of activity that transformed the atmosphere at Broken Arrow Ranch. The insurance money provided immediate financial relief, allowing them to catch up on overdue bills and purchase feed for the remaining cattle. More importantly, the discovery of David's hidden resources had given them something they'd been missing: hope. Emma threw herself into researching the ranch's historical significance, spending hours on the phone with the Montana Historical Society and the State Archaeological Department. The artifacts mentioned in the letter were apparently pottery fragments and tools, indicating a seasonal campsite used by indigenous tribes for hundreds of years. The designation process would take months, but initial indications suggested the ranch might qualify for historical protection status. Meanwhile, Jake focused on the practical aspects of David's organic transition plan. The certification process was complex and expensive, but the projected profit margins justified the investment if they could secure adequate financing. He spent hours studying soil reports, researching organic feed suppliers, and calculating the costs of converting their remaining cattle to organic production methods. Tommy seemed to sense the change in atmosphere around the ranch. His energy increased along with the adults' optimism, and he began following Jake around more closely, asking endless questions about cattle, horses, and ranch work. The boy's enthusiasm was infectious, and Jake found himself explaining things he'd learned from David and their father years earlier. One evening, as they sat around the kitchen table after dinner, Tommy looked up from his coloring book and made an announcement that caught both adults off guard. "I think Uncle Jake should marry Mama," he said with the straightforward logic of a 4-year-old. "Then he could be my new daddy, and we could all live here together forever." Emma's face flushed red, while Jake nearly choked on his coffee. They'd been carefully avoiding any direct discussion of their changing relationship, focusing instead on ranch business and practical concerns. Tommy's innocent observation forced them to confront feelings they'd been dancing around for weeks. "Tommy," Emma said carefully, "things between grown-ups are more complicated than that. Uncle Jake is helping us right now, but that doesn't mean we're going to get married." "Why not?" Tommy asked with the persistence that made him both endearing and exhausting. "Uncle Jake loves us, and we love him, and Daddy told me that people who love each other should be together." Jake felt his throat tighten at the boy's words. David had apparently had more conversations with his son than anyone realized, preparing him for possibilities that the adults were only beginning to acknowledge. The wisdom of a dying man, looking out for his family's future, was evident in Tommy's easy acceptance of changing circumstances. That night, after Tommy was asleep, Jake and Emma found themselves talking more openly than they had since finding David's letter. They sat in the living room with the fire crackling quietly between them, the weight of unspoken feelings pressing against the comfortable silence they'd maintained for so long. "I keep thinking about what Tommy said," Emma began, her voice soft in the firelight. "About people who love each other being together. It sounds so simple when a child says it." Jake shifted in his chair, the leather creaking under his weight. "Children don't understand the complications," he said. "They don't know about guilt and loyalty and what people might think." Emma turned to face him fully, her green eyes reflecting the dancing flames. "What do you think, Jake? Not about what people might say, or what David might have wanted, or what's proper. What do you want?" The question hung between them like a bridge neither of them had been brave enough to cross. Jake looked at this woman, who'd become the center of his world without him realizing it, who'd shown strength he hadn't known existed, who'd trusted him with her fears and hopes, and her son's future. The truth was both simple and terrifying. "I want to wake up every morning knowing you and Tommy are safe," Jake said slowly. I want to help Tommy learn to ride his first horse and teach him how to read cattle weather. I want to hold you when you're worried about the ranch or scared about the future." He paused, his throat tight with emotions he'd kept buried for months. "I want to build something with you, Emma. Not replace what you had with David, but create something new that honors his memory while giving us a chance at happiness." Emma rose from her chair and moved to the couch where Jake sat, settling beside him close enough that their shoulders touched. The contact sent warmth through him that had nothing to do with the fire. "I've been afraid," she admitted, her hand finding his in the space between them. "Afraid that choosing happiness meant betraying David's memory. Afraid that people would think I moved on too quickly, or that I was using you to solve my problems." She looked down at their joined hands, her wedding ring catching the firelight. "But David's letter made me realize something. He loved us both enough to want us to be happy, even if it meant being happy together." Jake lifted their joined hands and kissed her knuckles gently. A gesture of tenderness that felt both natural and momentous. Emma's breath caught at the contact, and when he looked up, her eyes were bright with unshed tears and something deeper. "I love you, Emma," Jake said, the words feeling both terrifying and liberating. "I've loved you for longer than I should have, longer than I was willing to admit. I love your strength and your stubbornness, and the way you make pancakes shaped like horses for Tommy." Emma's free hand came up to cup his face, her thumb tracing the line of his jaw. "I love you too," she whispered. "I love how gentle you are with Tommy, and how you never gave up on saving the ranch. I love that you read him bedtime stories in different voices, and that you always remember to put extra sugar in my coffee." The kiss that followed was inevitable and perfect, soft at first and then deeper as months of suppressed longing finally found expression. When they broke apart, both were breathing hard, and Emma's cheeks were flushed pink in the firelight. "Where does this leave us?" she asked quietly. Jake considered the question seriously. They were at a crossroads that would determine not just their romantic future but the entire direction of their lives. The ranch, Tommy's upbringing, their place in the Cedar Falls community. Everything depended on choices they made in the coming days and weeks. "It leaves us building something together," Jake said finally. "As partners in every sense. We save the ranch, we raise Tommy, and we see what kind of life we can create from the pieces David left behind." Emma smiled, the expression transforming her face with joy he hadn't seen since before David's accident. "That sounds perfect," she said, then laughed softly. "Well, terrifying and complicated, and probably difficult, but perfect." They spent the rest of the evening talking about practical matters, ranch business, and Tommy's schooling, and the logistics of their changing relationship. But underneath the practical conversation ran a current of deeper connection, the recognition that they'd crossed a line from which there was no retreat. The next morning brought unseasonable warmth that started melting the snow in patches around the ranch buildings. Jake woke in the bunkhouse, but found himself walking toward the main house with a lightness in his step he hadn't felt in years. Through the kitchen window, he could see Emma moving around, preparing breakfast, while Tommy sat at the table arranging his toy trucks in elaborate formations. The domestic scene pulled at something deep in Jake's chest, a longing for belonging that he'd suppressed since David's death. Now, with Emma's confession still warm in his memory and the promise of a shared future stretching ahead of them, he allowed himself to imagine being part of this family, officially, rather than just helping from the margins. Emma looked up as he entered the kitchen, and the smile she gave him was different from the polite gratitude he'd grown accustomed to over the past months. This smile was personal and intimate, acknowledgement of the new understanding between them. "Good morning," she said, her voice carrying warmth that had nothing to do with the coffee she poured for him. "Morning," he replied, accepting the cup and letting their fingers brush in the exchange. Tommy looked up from his trucks with the uncanny awareness children possessed for adult undercurrents. "You look happy today, Uncle Jake," the boy observed with 4-year-old directness. "Did something good happen?" Jake exchanged a glance with Emma, who nodded slightly. "Yes, buddy, something very good happened. Your mama and I decided we're going to work together to save the ranch and take care of each other." Tommy considered this information with the seriousness he applied to all important matters. "Does that mean you're going to marry mama like I said you should?" Emma laughed, the sound bright and genuine. Maybe someday, Tommy, but first we have a lot of work to do to make sure the ranch survives. The boy nodded, as if this made perfect sense to him, then returned to his trucks with the matter apparently settled in his mind. Jake marveled at the resilience of children, their ability to adapt to changing circumstances without the complicated emotional baggage that adults carried. Over breakfast, they discussed immediate priorities. The Historical Society had scheduled a visit for the following week to assess the archaeological significance of the artifacts found on the property. The organic certification process required soil testing and documentation that would take months to complete. Most importantly, they needed to develop a comprehensive business plan that would satisfy the bank and provide a roadmap for the ranch's financial future. Doc Henderson arrived mid-morning to check on the pregnant heifer that had been showing signs of distress. The veterinarian's experienced eye quickly assessed the situation, and she pronounced the cow ready to deliver within hours rather than days. "She's been carrying this calf longer than usual," Doc Henderson explained, her hands gentle as she examined the heifer. "First-time mothers sometimes need encouragement when the time comes. We'll want to keep a close eye on her today." Jake nodded, adding cattle monitoring to his growing list of responsibilities. The successful delivery of a healthy calf would provide both emotional boost and practical benefit, since they needed every animal to rebuild the herd according to David's organic plan. As Doc Henderson packed her equipment, she studied Jake and Emma with the perceptive gaze that made her such an effective veterinarian. "The two of you seem different today," she observed. "More settled somehow." Emma glanced at Jake before answering. "We found some things of David's that changed our perspective on the ranch's future, and we've decided to work together more closely to implement his plans." Doc Henderson's smile suggested she understood more than the carefully neutral words conveyed. "David would be pleased to know his plans are moving forward," she said. "He always believed this ranch had potential that hadn't been fully realized." After the veterinarian left, Jake and Emma spent the afternoon in David's study, organizing papers and developing the comprehensive business plan that would demonstrate the ranch's viability to Frank Garrett and his superiors at the bank. The work was tedious but necessary, requiring them to quantify every aspect of the operation from feed costs to projected organic beef prices. Working closely together revealed new dimensions of their compatibility. Emma's teaching background made her excellent at research and organization, while Jake's practical ranching experience provided realistic context for their projections. They complemented each other's strengths and compensated for each other's weaknesses in ways that felt natural and efficient. Late in the afternoon, as shadows lengthened across the snow-covered pastures, the pregnant heifer began showing signs of active labor. Jake and Emma took turns monitoring her progress, while Tommy played quietly nearby, his presence somehow comforting to the nervous cow. The birth was difficult but ultimately successful, with Jake assisting during the final stages while Emma kept Tommy at a safe distance. When the calf finally emerged, slippery and dark against the straw bedding, Tommy's excited cheers seemed to awaken something protective in the new mother. "It's a bull," Jake announced, clearing the calf's airways and ensuring its breathing was strong and regular. "Healthy and strong, probably close to 80 pounds. Emma's face glowed with excitement as she watched the calf struggle to its feet on unsteady legs. In the context of their financial struggles and uncertain future, the successful birth felt like a sign of hope, evidence that life could emerge from difficulty and thrive with proper care. "Can I name him?" Tommy asked, pressing close to the stall rail with characteristic enthusiasm. "What would you like to call him?" Emma replied, lifting her son so he could see better. Tommy studied the calf with serious concentration, his small face scrunched with thought. "He looks brave," the boy decided, "like he's not afraid of anything. I want to call him Courage." The name seemed perfect, capturing both the calf's spirited first steps and the emotional journey the family had undertaken together. Jake found himself thinking that David would have approved of his son's choice, recognizing the symbolism in naming the first new life born since his death. That evening, after a celebratory dinner featuring Emma's famous beef stew and fresh cornbread, they sat on the porch despite the cold air.
Tommy had fallen asleep between them on the porch swing, wrapped in one of Emma's quilts, while the adults talked quietly about plans and possibilities. The ranch felt different somehow, as if the successful birth and their personal breakthrough had shifted the entire atmosphere from desperate survival to cautious optimism. Stars appeared one by one in the darkening sky, and Jake found himself thinking about David's letter and the blessing his brother had given them from beyond the grave. "I keep wondering what David would think if he could see us now," Emma said softly, her hand resting on Tommy's sleeping form. Jake considered the question seriously. "I think he'd be relieved," he said finally. "David always worried about leaving you and Tommy alone if something happened to him. Knowing we're facing the future together would give him peace." Emma nodded, then leaned her head against Jake's shoulder with a contentment that felt both new and timeless. The gesture was simple but profound, acknowledgement of trust and affection that had grown from shared hardship and mutual respect. Tomorrow they would continue working on the business plan, dealing with bank officials and government inspectors, and all the practical challenges of transforming David's dreams into reality. But tonight, sitting on the porch of the ranch house where 3 generations of Mitchells had lived and worked, Jake felt something he hadn't experienced since childhood. The absolute certainty of belonging exactly where he was meant to be. The pregnant heifer had delivered successfully, producing new life that represented both literal and symbolic renewal for Broken Arrow Ranch. Tommy had chosen a name that captured the courage required to face an uncertain future with hope rather than fear. Emma had opened her heart to possibilities she'd been afraid to consider, while Jake had finally allowed himself to believe he deserved happiness despite the guilt he'd carried for months. As the night grew colder, and Tommy stirred in his sleep, Jake realized that this moment represented a turning point not just in their relationship but in their entire approach to life. Instead of simply surviving from day to day, they were finally ready to start building something together. David's legacy would live on through the ranch, but it would also evolve and grow in ways that honored his
memory while creating space for new love and new hope. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns while the 3 people on the porch settled into a comfortable silence that spoke of family and future and the kind of deep contentment that comes from knowing you're exactly where you belong. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, bound by love that had grown from friendship and watered by shared tears and strengthened by common purpose. Inside the house, the fire burned low but steady, casting warm light through the windows like a beacon in the Montana darkness. The ranch that had seemed doomed just weeks earlier now pulsed with renewed life and possibility, proof that even the most desperate situations could transform with courage, love, and the willingness to believe in tomorrow. Spring arrived early that year, bringing with it a cascade of changes that transformed Broken Arrow Ranch from a struggling operation into something that resembled David's original vision. The Historical Society had officially designated portions of the property as culturally significant, providing protection from development and qualifying the ranch for grants that helped fund the organic certification process. The water rights David's grandfather had secured proved even more valuable than expected, with neighboring developers offering substantial leasing fees for access that provided steady income while maintaining ranch ownership. Jake moved his belongings from the bunkhouse to the main house on a warm April morning when wildflowers were beginning to dot the pastures with color. Tommy helped carry boxes with the seriousness of a child who understood he was witnessing something important, while Emma supervised the process with a mixture of nervousness and joy that made Jake's heart race every time he caught her watching him. The wedding was scheduled for June, a simple ceremony in the ranch's front yard with Pastor Roberts officiating and the entire Cedar Falls community invited. Emma had insisted on keeping things modest, but Maria Santos and the other ranch wives had different ideas about what constituted appropriate celebration for the town's most talked-about romance. "You can't have a ranch wedding without a proper reception," Maria declared during one of her frequent visits to help with planning. David would want his family celebrated properly, and that includes Jake now. Emma's protests about expense and simplicity were overruled by women who'd been organizing community celebrations for decades. Before she knew it, she was being fitted for a dress that Maria's daughter had altered from her own wedding gown, while Jake found himself measured for a suit that would be borrowed from Pastor Robert's son. The organic certification process moved forward with encouraging progress. The soil tests revealed exactly the mineral balance that David had predicted, and the remaining cattle adapted well to organic feed supplements. More importantly, Jake's negotiations with specialty restaurants in Billings and Bozeman had secured contracts for direct beef sales at premium prices that justified the additional expenses of organic production. Frank Garrett's attitude toward the ranch underwent a remarkable transformation once he realized that Broken Arrow was becoming profitable rather than sliding toward bankruptcy. The banker who had threatened foreclosure now spoke enthusiastically about the ranch's potential as a model for sustainable agriculture in Montana. Jake suspected that Frank's newfound optimism had less to do with agricultural philosophy than with his bank's desire to be associated with success stories. Tommy thrived in the atmosphere of renewal and celebration that surrounded the ranch. His nightmares about his father's death became less frequent, replaced by excited chatter about the wedding and his new role as Jake's stepson. The boy had adapted to calling Jake Dad with an ease that both warmed Jake's heart and occasionally left him breathless with the weight of responsibility. One evening in late May, as Jake was checking on the cattle before dark, Tommy appeared at his side with the determined expression that usually preceded important questions. "Dad," the boy said, and Jake still felt a jolt of pride and terror at the title. "Are you going to have babies with Mama?" Jake knelt to bring himself to Tommy's eye level, considering how to handle a question that Emma should probably address. "What made you think about that, buddy?" Tommy kicked at a clump of grass with the toe of his boot. "Maria's granddaughter said that when people get married, they have babies. I was wondering if I'd get a brother or sister." The innocent question opened territories that Jake and Emma had discussed only in whispers during their rare moments alone. They both wanted more children, but Emma's difficult pregnancy with Tommy and David's death had created fears about the risks of childbirth in isolated ranch country. "That's something your mama and I will decide together," Jake said carefully. "But whether we have more babies or not, you'll always be my first son and the most important little person in my life." Tommy nodded solemnly, apparently satisfied with this answer. Then he brightened with the quick mood changes of childhood. "Can I help with the cows tomorrow? The new bull looks lonely without friends." Jake laughed, recognizing Emma's influence in Tommy's concern for the animal's emotional welfare. The new bull, purchased with insurance money and chosen for his gentle temperament and organic breeding credentials, did indeed seem to prefer solitude to socializing with the heifers. "We'll introduce him to the ladies slowly," Jake promised. "Sometimes it takes time for everyone to feel comfortable with new arrangements." The wisdom of his own words struck him as he spoke them. The past year had been a process of gradual adjustment for everyone involved, learning to navigate relationships and responsibilities that none of them had expected. Tommy had adjusted to sharing his mother's attention, Emma had learned to balance independence with partnership, and Jake had discovered that love and family could coexist with guilt and loss without diminishing either. Dr. Henderson's visits had become less frequent as the cattle settled into healthy routines, but she continued stopping by to check on what she called the ranch's overall well-being. During one such visit in early June, she found Jake repairing fence while Emma worked in the garden she'd established behind the house. "This place feels completely different from a year ago," the veterinarian observed, leaning against the fence post Jake was securing. "There's life here again, Hope." Jake paused in his work to survey the ranch that had become home in ways he'd never imagined possible. The pastures were green with spring growth, cattle grazed contentedly in the distance, and the sound of Tommy's laughter carried from where he was helping Emma plant tomatoes. "David would be amazed at what you've accomplished," Doc Henderson continued. "Not just the business success, but the family you've created. He always worried about leaving Emma and Tommy alone, but I don't think he could have imagined a better solution than what actually happened." Jake secured the wire with more force than necessary, still uncomfortable with praise that felt undeserved. "I just did what anyone would do in the same situation." "No," Doc Henderson said firmly. "What anyone would do is help temporarily and then move on with their own lives. What you did was commit to a future that required sacrifice and courage and love. David recognized that potential in you, which is why he felt safe leaving that letter." The mention of David's letter brought back memories of that desperate afternoon when their future had seemed impossible. Now, with the wedding just weeks away, and the ranch thriving beyond their most optimistic projections, Jake sometimes had trouble believing that their current happiness was real rather than an elaborate dream. Emma appeared at his elbow with a glass of lemonade and soil under her fingernails from the garden work. Her hair was escaping from its ponytail, and there was a streak of dirt on her cheek, but Jake thought she'd never looked more beautiful than she did in that moment, comfortable and confident in her role as ranch partner and future wife. "Tommy wants to know if he can ride Courage to the wedding," she said, referencing the bull calf that had grown into a surprisingly gentle yearling with an unusual fondness for human attention. "Absolutely not," Jake replied, taking the lemonade gratefully. "We'll find him a more appropriate wedding role that doesn't involve potential trampling of guests." Emma laughed, the sound bright against the evening air. "He's also convinced that Courage should be the ring bearer since he was born right after we decided to get married." Doc Henderson chuckled at the boy's logic. "Children have a way of making connections that adults miss," she observed. "Maybe there's wisdom in recognizing the significance of timing." The wedding day dawned clear and warm, with the kind of perfect Montana weather that made the landscape look like a painting. Emma woke in the main house while Jake spent his last night as a bachelor in the bunkhouse, honoring Emma's insistence on maintaining some traditional elements despite the unconventional nature of their courtship. Maria Santos and her daughters arrived early to help Emma prepare, transforming the ranch kitchen into a beauty salon with curling irons, makeup, and enough hair products to supply a city wedding. Tommy submitted to having his hair slicked down and his new suit adjusted with the patient resignation of a child who understood the importance of the day, even if he didn't enjoy the primping process. Jake dressed with the help of Pastor Roberts and two neighboring ranchers who'd volunteered as groomsmen. The borrowed suit fit reasonably well, and the new boots he'd purchased for the occasion felt stiff but dignified. Looking in the bunkhouse mirror, he saw a man who bore little resemblance to the guilt-ridden hermit he'd been just a year earlier. Guests began arriving by mid-morning, parking trucks and cars in the pasture designated for the purpose, while Tommy and the Santos grandchildren directed traffic with the authority of miniature wedding coordinators. The entire Cedar Falls community seemed to have accepted invitations, along with Emma's family from Billings and several of Jake's old ranching friends, who'd driven considerable distances to witness his transformation from confirmed bachelor to family man. The ceremony itself was simple and heartfelt, with Emma radiant in her altered dress and Jake struggling to maintain composure as she walked toward him across the grass. Tommy stood beside Jake as best man, holding the rings with ceremonial seriousness that dissolved into giggles when Courage wandered close to the assembled guests and had to be gently redirected by one of the ranchers. Pastor Roberts spoke about love growing from friendship, about families formed by choice rather than just biology, and about the courage required to build new happiness from the foundations of loss. His words resonated with the assembled community, most of whom had witnessed the gradual transformation of the Mitchell family over the past year. When Jake kissed his bride, the cheers from the crowd seemed to echo across the entire valley, a celebration not just of their marriage but of survival and renewal, and the stubborn persistence of hope in the face of overwhelming challenges. The reception lasted until sunset, with dancing on a wooden platform that the ranch neighbors had constructed in the yard, food contributed by every family in the county, and toasts that ranged from tearfully sentimental to hilariously embarrassing. Emma danced with every man present, from Tommy's enthusiastic bouncing to the careful waltzing of elderly ranchers who remembered her wedding to David with equal fondness. Jake found himself surrounded by well-wishers throughout the afternoon, men who slapped his back and pronounced him lucky, women who kissed his cheek and whispered advice about marriage and family. The attention was overwhelming but welcome, acceptance into a community that had watched his journey from outsider to insider with approval and support. As the evening wound down and guests began departing, Jake and Emma found themselves alone on the porch where they'd shared so many conversations over the past year. Tommy had fallen asleep in Emma's arms during the last dance, and she rocked him gently while Jake removed his tie and rolled up his sleeves. "Mrs. Sullivan," Jake said experimentally, testing how the name sounded in the quiet air. Emma smiled at him over Tommy's sleeping head. "I like the sound of that," she replied. "Mrs. Emma Sullivan, wife of Jake Sullivan, mother of Tommy Sullivan, partner in Broken Arrow Ranch." Jake reached over to smooth Tommy's hair where it had escaped the careful styling of the morning. "And stepfather of the bravest little cowboy in Montana," he added. They sat in comfortable silence while the last of the party cleanup continued around them, neighbors and friends working together to restore the ranch yard to its normal state. The sight of so many people invested in their happiness and success moved Jake in ways he couldn't adequately express. The ranch that had seemed doomed just a year earlier now buzzed with life and possibility. The organic certification had been approved, the historical designation provided protection and prestige, and the water rights generated income that provided financial stability beyond what David had ever imagined. More importantly, the family that had been broken by tragedy had been rebuilt stronger and more resilient than before. Emma stood carefully to avoid waking Tommy, and Jake followed her inside to help put the boy to bed. As they tucked him into the small bed in his room, Tommy stirred briefly and mumbled something about courage and tractors before settling back into deep sleep. In the hallway outside Tommy's room, Emma turned to face Jake with an expression that mixed exhaustion and exhilaration and something deeper that made his breath catch in his throat. "Thank you," she said softly, her hands coming up to rest on his chest. "For everything, for saving us, for loving us, for choosing us over the easier path of walking away." Jake covered her hands with his own, marveling at how perfectly they fit together and how right this all felt despite the unconventional route they'd taken to reach this moment. "Thank you for letting me stay," he replied. "For seeing past the guilt and fear to something worth building with." Emma stood on her toes to kiss him, and Jake thought about David's letter and blessing, about Tommy's innocent wisdom, about Doc Henderson's observation that good people sometimes found themselves in impossible situations that turned out to be exactly where they belonged. The Montana night stretched endlessly around their small island of light and warmth, stars wheeling overhead in patterns that had witnessed countless other stories of loss and recovery and hope. Inside the ranch house where 3 generations of Mitchells had lived and loved and built something lasting, a new family settled into sleep with the contentment that comes from knowing that tomorrow would bring challenges they were ready to face together. Jake Sullivan, no longer haunted by guilt over his brother's death, held his wife close and listened to the sounds of the ranch settling for the night. Cattle moved quietly in distant pastures. The wind whispered through trees that David's grandfather had planted, and somewhere in the darkness, Courage and the other animals that depended on them for care rested peacefully under the vast Montana sky. The story that had begun with tragedy and separation had transformed into something rich and complex and deeply satisfying, proof that love could grow in the most unexpected places and that families could be formed by choice and commitment rather than just blood. David's legacy lived on not just in the ranch he'd planned, but in the happiness he'd made possible through wisdom and generosity that extended beyond death itself. 2 years later, Emma stood in the kitchen of the ranch house she now truly called home, her hands resting on the gentle curve of her growing belly, while she watched Jake and Tommy repair the fence line that separated their property from the Santos ranch. The morning sun caught the copper highlights in Tommy's hair as he handed tools to his stepfather with the practiced efficiency of a 6-year-old who'd grown up around ranch work. The pregnancy had been a surprise, coming just 18 months after their wedding when they'd finally stopped worrying about the ranch's financial stability long enough to consider expanding their family. This time Emma felt none of the fear that had plagued her during her pregnancy with Tommy. Doc Henderson assured her that everything was progressing normally, and more importantly, she wasn't facing the uncertainty alone. Jake had been almost comically protective since they'd learned about the baby, insisting on taking over the heavier ranch chores and watching Emma with the intensity of a man who'd learned not to take happiness for granted. His concern was touching but occasionally overwhelming, leading to gentle arguments about Emma's capability and independence that usually ended with both of them laughing at his overprotective tendencies. The ranch itself had exceeded their most optimistic projections. The organic beef operation now supplied 3 high-end restaurants in Billings and Bozeman with premium steaks that commanded prices double those of conventional beef. The historical designation had brought a steady stream of visitors interested in the Native American artifacts, generating additional income through educational tours that Emma had developed and led herself. More importantly, they'd created something that felt sustainable and meaningful, a business that honored the land while providing financial security for their growing family.
David's dreams had been realized in ways he probably never imagined, transformed by tragedy into something stronger and more resilient than the original vision. Tommy burst through the kitchen door with the energy that characterized all his entrances, his face flushed with excitement and dirt streaking his clothes in patterns that suggested close contact with ranch animals. "Mama," he announced breathlessly. "The new calf is trying to follow Courage everywhere he goes. Dad says it thinks Courage is his mama because he was the first thing it saw when it was born." Emma smiled at her son's enthusiasm, remembering how Jake had worried initially about Tommy accepting him as a father figure. Those concerns had proven groundless as the boy embraced his new family structure with the adaptability that made children so remarkable. Tommy called Jake Dad without hesitation now, though he still spoke of David with love and pride when prompted. "Where is your father now?" Emma asked, noting the absence of Jake's familiar presence. "He's fixing the water trough in the north pasture," Tommy replied, already moving toward the cookie jar with the single-minded focus that drove most of his actions. "He said to tell you he'll be back for lunch." Emma nodded and continued preparing the midday meal that had become a cornerstone of their daily routine. The kitchen table where they gathered 3 times a day had witnessed countless conversations about ranch business, family concerns, and the small daily victories that comprised a life lived in partnership. Jake often said that these meals were his favorite part of each day. The moments when their scattered individual activities converged into shared purpose. The sound of an approaching vehicle drew Emma's attention to the window, where she could see Maria Santos' familiar truck navigating the ranch road with its characteristic cloud of dust. Maria's visits had become more frequent since Emma's pregnancy announcement, her maternal instincts extending naturally to include the young woman she'd helped through so many challenges over the past 3 years. Maria emerged from her truck carrying a covered dish and wearing the expression of someone with news to share. Her visits always brought community gossip, practical advice, and homemade food that somehow improved everything she brought it to. Today she also carried an official-looking envelope that immediately caught Emma's attention. "This came to our mailbox by mistake," Maria explained, handing over the envelope addressed to Mr. and Mrs. Jake Sullivan. "The postman's been making errors ever since his grandson started helping with deliveries." Emma accepted the envelope with curiosity, noting the return address from the Montana Department of Agriculture. Official correspondence still made her nervous, a lingering anxiety from the desperate months when every piece of mail might have contained foreclosure notices or demands for payment they couldn't meet. Maria settled into her usual chair at the kitchen table while Emma opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a formal letter congratulating Broken Arrow Ranch on being selected as Montana's outstanding organic operation for the current year, an honor that came with both recognition and a substantial cash prize. Emma read the letter twice before the full meaning penetrated her consciousness. The award represented validation of everything they'd worked to build, official acknowledgement that their operation had achieved excellence in sustainable agriculture. More practically, the prize money would fund the expansion projects Jake had been planning for next year. Maria read the letter over Emma's shoulder, her excitement building with each paragraph. "This is wonderful news," she exclaimed. "The whole county will be talking about this for months." Tommy looked up from his cookies with interest, sensing the adult excitement without understanding its source. "What's an outstanding organic operation?" he asked with the directness that made adult explanations both necessary and challenging. "It means that people who know about ranching think Dad and I are doing a really good job taking care of our cattle and our land," Emma explained, pulling her son close with one arm while holding the letter with the other hand. Tommy considered this information seriously. "Does that mean we're the best ranch in Montana?" Emma laughed at his leap to superlatives. "It means we're one of the good ones," she said diplomatically. "Dad will be so proud when he sees this letter." The conversation was interrupted by Jake's return from the north pasture, his work clothes dusty and his face showing the satisfaction of a man who'd successfully repaired something that needed fixing. He kissed Emma's cheek and ruffled Tommy's hair in the automatic gestures of domestic affection that had become natural over their years together. Maria held up the letter with theatrical excitement before Jake could settle into his usual chair. Congratulations, she announced dramatically. You're now married to the co-owner of Montana's outstanding organic operation. Jake took the letter with the skeptical expression he reserved for news that seemed too good to be true. His eyes widened as he read, and Emma watched his face transform from disbelief to pride to something deeper that made her throat tight with emotion. David would be amazed, Jake said quietly, his voice carrying the reverence he reserved for discussions of his late brother. He always believed this ranch could be something special, but I don't think even he imagined something like this. The award represented more than professional recognition. It was vindication of the path they'd chosen when easier options had been available. They could have sold to the developers, taken the money, and started over somewhere else without the complications of preserving David's legacy. Instead, they'd chosen the harder route that honored the past while building toward the future. Maria stayed for lunch, her presence adding the warmth that made even ordinary meals feel celebratory. The conversation ranged from ranch business to community gossip to speculation about whether Emma was carrying a boy or girl. Tommy contributed his own theories about the baby's gender based on elaborate reasoning involving the behavior of ranch animals and the phase of the moon. After Maria left, Jake and Emma found themselves alone on the porch that had witnessed so many significant moments in their relationship. Tommy was napping inside, exhausted by the morning's excitement and the steady growth that seemed to require enormous amounts of sleep. Emma settled into the swing beside Jake, her hand finding his with the automatic connection that had developed over their years together. The afternoon stretched ahead of them with the lazy quality of summer days that moved at ranch pace rather than city urgency. I keep thinking about that night when we almost lost everything, Emma said, her voice soft in the warm air. When Frank Garrett threatened foreclosure and it seemed like we'd have to sell to the developers. Jake remembered that night vividly. The desperation and fear that had driven them to search David's papers for anything that might save the ranch. The insurance policy and safety deposit box had provided the financial breathing room they'd needed, but the real salvation had come from their decision to work together rather than face the crisis alone. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if we'd made different choices, Jake replied. If I'd left like I planned to, if you'd taken Tommy and moved to Chicago with your sister. Emma shifted to face him more directly, her green eyes serious in the afternoon light. We didn't make different choices, she said firmly. We made the right choices, the brave choices. And look what we built because of them. She gestured toward the ranch that spread around them in all directions. The cattle grazing peacefully in pastures that had been restored to health through careful management. The buildings that had been repaired and improved through their combined efforts. More importantly, she was indicating the family they'd created from the ashes of tragedy and loss. The baby chose that moment to make its presence known with a series of energetic kicks that made Emma gasp and laugh simultaneously. Jake's hand moved automatically to her belly, his face lighting up with wonder at the feel of new life moving beneath his palm. Active today, he observed, his voice carrying the awe that still surprised him every time he felt the baby move. Takes after Tommy, Emma replied, remembering her son's constant motion even before birth. This one's going to keep us busy from the moment it arrives. Jake leaned over to press his ear against Emma's belly, listening for sounds of movement or heartbeat with the intense focus he brought to anything involving his family's welfare. The baby responded with another series of kicks that made him laugh with pure joy. Hello in there, he whispered to Emma's belly. This is your dad talking. We're all out here waiting to meet you, and we've got a pretty amazing place prepared for your arrival. Emma ran her fingers through Jake's hair while he talked to their unborn child, marveling at the man who'd emerged from the guilt-ridden hermit she'd first known. Fatherhood had transformed him in ways that went beyond the practical aspects of caring for Tommy. It had given him permission to hope for the future and invest in happiness rather than simply enduring each day. The sun was setting by the time they roused themselves from the peaceful interlude on the porch. Tommy appeared in the doorway with the rumpled
appearance of a child who'd napped hard, his hair sticking up at impossible angles and his clothes twisted from sleep. "Is it time for dinner?" he asked hopefully. His internal clock as reliable as any timepiece when it came to meals. Emma struggled to rise from the swing with the awkwardness that had become more pronounced as her pregnancy progressed. Jake was instantly at her side, offering support with the automatic chivalry that both touched and occasionally exasperated her. Inside the warm kitchen, they moved through the familiar choreography of meal preparation that had evolved over their years together. Tommy set the table with the careful attention to detail that Emma had taught him, while Jake washed vegetables from the garden. Emma had expanded each year since their marriage. Emma supervised from her position at the stove, directing operations with the efficiency of someone who'd learned to manage a household and business simultaneously. The dinner conversation centered on the day's events, from Tommy's observations about calf behavior to Jake's progress on the pasture improvements that would support their expanding herd. The award letter sat propped against the salt shaker like a centerpiece, its formal language a reminder of how far they'd traveled from the desperate circumstances of just a few years earlier. After Tommy was tucked into bed with his customary protests about not being tired despite obvious exhaustion, Jake and Emma returned to their evening ritual of sitting together while the ranch settled for the night. These quiet moments had become precious to both of them, opportunities to process the day's events and plan for tomorrow's challenges. The baby's room was nearly finished, painted in soft yellow since they'd chosen to be surprised by the gender. Jake had built the crib himself from wood cut on their own property, sanding and finishing it with the same attention to detail he brought to all his projects. Emma had sewn curtains and arranged furniture with the nesting instincts that had intensified as her due date approached. "I've been thinking about names," Emma said, her hand resting on her belly where the baby had finally settled into sleep. "For a boy, I'd like to use David as a middle name, to honor your brother and make sure this child knows where he comes from." Jake felt his throat tighten at the suggestion. David would be honored, he managed, his voice rough with emotion. "What about first names? For a boy, maybe James after your grandfather." Emma replied, "For a girl, I was thinking Grace after my grandmother." Both names felt right to Jake, connecting their child to family history while avoiding the complexity of using David's name directly. Tommy had accepted the baby's upcoming arrival with enthusiasm once they'd assured him that he'd remain their firstborn and special in ways that couldn't be replaced. The months ahead would bring new challenges as they adjusted to caring for an infant while managing the ranch and raising Tommy. But sitting in the peaceful evening air with Emma beside him and their child moving gently beneath her skin, Jake felt ready for whatever difficulties lay ahead. The ranch that had once seemed doomed now thrived beyond their most optimistic projections. The family that had been broken by tragedy had been rebuilt stronger and more resilient than before. Most importantly, they'd learned that love could grow from the most unlikely circumstances, that happiness could emerge from loss, and that families could be formed by choice and commitment rather than just biology. David's legacy lived on not just in the ranch he'd envisioned, but in the love he'd made possible through wisdom and generosity that had extended beyond death itself. His blessing had given Jake and Emma permission to build something new while honoring what had come before, creating a foundation strong enough to support whatever the future might bring. As the stars emerged one by one in the darkening Montana sky, Jake reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment of contentment and anticipation. The guilt that had once consumed him had been transformed into gratitude for the second chance he'd been given. The grief that had nearly destroyed Emma had evolved into appreciation for the life she'd been able to rebuild. Tomorrow would bring the usual challenges of ranch life, along with preparations for the baby's arrival and the ongoing work of building something lasting in a world that seemed to change more rapidly each year. But tonight, surrounded by the sounds of cattle settling for sleep and the warmth of family close beside him, Jake Sullivan felt the deep satisfaction that came from knowing he was exactly where he belonged. The story that had begun with tragedy and separation had become something rich and meaningful, proof that even the most desperate circumstances could be transformed through courage, love, and the willingness to believe in possibilities that couldn't be seen from the valley of despair. David's dreams had been realized in ways he'd never imagined, carried forward by people who'd found in each other the strength to honor the past while embracing the future. 5 years had passed since that first desperate winter when everything seemed lost, and Jake Sullivan stood in the delivery room of Cedar Falls General Hospital holding his newborn daughter while Emma rested peacefully in the bed beside him. Little Grace Elizabeth Sullivan had arrived 3 weeks early but healthy and strong, her tiny fingers wrapped around Jake's thumb with surprising determination. Tommy pressed close to the hospital bed, his 8-year-old face serious as he studied his baby sister with the intensity he brought to all important matters. She's really small, he observed, his voice carrying wonder rather than disappointment. But her grip is strong like a calf that's going to be a good one. Emma laughed softly at her son's ranching comparison, though exhaustion made even laughter feel like effort. Everything's a cattle metaphor with you, she teased, reaching out to smooth Tommy's hair where it stuck up from his nervous fidgeting in the hospital waiting room. Jake marveled at the perfect miniature features of his daughter, from her dark hair that matched Emma's to her serious expression that seemed to suggest she was already evaluating her new surroundings. Grace had been born during a late spring blizzard that had required Dr. Henderson to drive Jake and Emma to the hospital in her four-wheel drive truck when their own vehicle couldn't navigate the icy roads. The birth had been easier than Tommy's had been for Emma, though Jake had spent the entire labor pacing the hospital corridors like an expectant father in old movies. Maria Santos had stayed at the ranch with 3 neighboring women, managing the cattle and preparing the house for the baby's arrival with the efficiency of women who'd organized countless family emergencies over the decades. Doc Henderson appeared in the doorway wearing scrubs and the satisfied expression of someone who'd successfully managed a medical crisis. She'd assisted with the delivery when the hospital's regular obstetrician was delayed by the storm, her veterinary skills translating surprisingly well to human medicine in emergency situations. Mother and baby are both doing beautifully, she announced, though she directed her comments primarily to Jake, who still looked slightly shell-shocked by the rapid progression of events. Grace is small but perfectly formed, with excellent reflexes and lung capacity that suggests she'll have no trouble making her needs known. Tommy giggled at the doctor's diplomatic way of saying the baby cried loudly. She sounds like the bull calf we had last spring, he said with the satisfaction of someone who'd identified another useful comparison. Really loud but healthy. Emma shifted carefully in the hospital bed, her body still recovering from the intensity of childbirth, but her eyes bright with the fierce love that seemed to arrive simultaneously with new babies. "Can I hold her?" she asked Jake, who carefully transferred their daughter to Emma's waiting arms. The sight of Emma cradling Grace while Tommy leaned in to touch his sister's tiny hand filled Jake with emotions too complex to name easily. Gratitude certainly for the miracle of healthy birth and growing family. Pride in Emma's strength and Tommy's gentle acceptance of his new role as big brother. But underneath ran deeper currents of amazement that his life had transformed so completely from the isolated existence he'd lived before David's death brought Emma and Tommy into his world. The ranch they'd returned to in a few days bore little resemblance to the struggling operation that had seemed doomed to foreclosure 5 years earlier. The organic certification had opened markets they'd never imagined, with Broken Arrow beef now served in restaurants as far away as Denver and Seattle. The historical designation had brought steady income through educational tours, while the water rights continued generating lease payments from neighboring developments. More importantly, they'd created something sustainable that honored both the land and their family's future. Tommy was already showing signs of the ranching instincts that had characterized Mitchell men for 3 generations, asking intelligent questions about cattle breeding and pasture management that suggested he might eventually want to carry on the family operation. The hospital room filled gradually with visitors bearing flowers, stuffed animals and casseroles that would feed the family for weeks. Maria Santos arrived with her daughters and granddaughters, all of whom wanted to hold the baby and offer advice about infant care that Emma accepted with gracious patience. Pastor Roberts stopped by to offer congratulations and schedule Grace's baptism, while Frank Garrett surprised everyone by bringing a savings bond for the baby's college fund. Jake watched the parade of community members with quiet amazement at how thoroughly his family had been accepted into the fabric of Cedar Falls society. The man who'd once lived as a hermit on the margins of the community now found himself surrounded by friends and neighbors who celebrated his joys and supported him through difficulties with the loyalty that characterized rural Montana communities. When visiting hours ended and the hospital grew quiet, Jake and Emma finally had time to process the momentous changes of the day. Tommy had fallen asleep in the reclining chair beside Emma's bed, exhausted by the excitement and emotional intensity of becoming a big brother. Grace slept peacefully in the hospital bassinet, her tiny chest rising and falling with the steady rhythm that indicated all systems functioning normally. "She's perfect," Emma said softly.
her voice filled with the wonder that new mothers experienced regardless of how many children they'd already raised. "Look at her fingers, Jake. They're so tiny but so complete." Jake studied his daughter's miniature hands, marveling at fingernails no bigger than pinheads and the intricate perfection of joints and tendons that would eventually allow her to hold reins and throw hay bales and perform all the tasks that comprised ranch life. The thought of Grace growing up at Broken Arrow Ranch, learning to love the land and animals as he and David had learned from their father, filled him with anticipation for the years ahead. "I keep thinking about David," Emma continued, her voice thoughtful in the quiet room. "How much he would have loved being Uncle David to Grace. He would have spoiled her completely." Jake nodded, feeling the familiar ache that accompanied thoughts of his deceased brother. David's presence remained strong at the ranch despite the years that had passed since his death. His photographs lined the hallway. His favorite coffee mug still occupied a place of honor in the kitchen cabinet, and his vision for the ranch continued guiding their decisions about expansion and improvement. Tommy stirred in his chair and opened sleepy eyes that immediately sought out his baby sister. "Is she still here?" he asked with the confusion of someone awakening in an unfamiliar place. "She's not going anywhere, buddy," Jake assured him. "Grace is ours to keep forever." Tommy nodded solemnly and padded over to the bassinet where he could study Grace more closely. "She's going to be a good rancher," he announced with the confidence of an expert evaluator. "I can tell by the way she holds her hands." Emma and Jake exchanged amused glances at their son's continued insistence on viewing everything through the lens of ranching experience. Tommy had appointed himself Grace's instructor in all matters related to cattle, horses, and land management, despite her current inability to focus her eyes consistently. The next morning brought discharge paperwork and the logistical challenge of transporting a newborn baby through early spring weather that remained unpredictable. Doc Henderson had cleared the roads with her truck and chains, creating a path that Jake's vehicle could navigate safely with precious cargo. The drive home felt ceremonial, as if they were bringing royalty to the ranch rather than simply adding another family member to their household. Tommy maintained a steady commentary about landmarks and cattle they passed, apparently convinced that Grace needed detailed information about her new home territory despite her obvious inability to process complex geographical data. Maria Santos and her crew had transformed the ranch house during their brief absence, filling the refrigerator with prepared meals, decorating Grace's nursery with handmade quilts and wooden toys, and ensuring that every surface was clean enough to satisfy the most demanding new mother. Pink balloons tied to the mailbox announced the baby's arrival to anyone who might have missed the news. Inside the familiar warmth of home, Grace seemed to settle immediately into the rhythm of ranch life. She slept peacefully through the sounds of cattle lowing in distant pastures and Tommy's excited chatter about his plans for teaching her to ride horses and help with chores. The nursery that Jake had prepared with such careful attention felt exactly right when occupied by its intended inhabitant. That evening, as Emma nursed Grace in the rocking chair Jake had crafted from wood grown on their own land, Tommy settled on the floor beside them with his homework spread across the coffee table. The domestic scene represented everything Jake had never dared hope for during his years of isolation and self-imposed penance. The ranch that had seemed doomed now thrived beyond their most optimistic projections. The family that had been broken by tragedy had been rebuilt stronger and more resilient than before. Most importantly, they'd created something that would endure, a legacy worthy of David's memory and a foundation strong enough to support whatever challenges the future might bring. Grace Elizabeth Sullivan had arrived not just as an addition to their family but as a symbol of continuity and hope, proof that life could emerge from loss and that love multiplied rather than divided when shared among more people. Her tiny presence in the ranch house represented the future of Broken Arrow Ranch and the ongoing story of the Mitchell family's relationship with the Montana land they'd called home for 4 generations. Jake looked out the window at the pastures where cattle grazed peacefully under the vast Montana sky, then back at his wife and children gathered in the warm circle of lamplight. David's blessing had made this moment possible, his wisdom and generosity extending beyond death to create happiness he'd never lived to witness, but had somehow made inevitable through his final letter and the love that had inspired it. The story that had begun with guilt and grief had become something beautiful and lasting. Proof that even the most desperate circumstances could be transformed through courage, commitment, and the willingness to believe in redemption that came not through forgetting the past, but through building something worthy of those who could no longer build for themselves. 10 years had transformed Broken Arrow Ranch into something that would have astounded David Mitchell beyond his wildest dreams. Jake Sullivan stood on the hill overlooking the main pasture, watching his 12-year-old son Tommy work with a young colt, while 4-year-old Grace perched on the fence rail, offering commentary that was both enthusiastic and surprisingly insightful for someone who barely reached the horse's shoulder. The ranch now covered 800 acres after Jake and Emma had purchased adjoining properties from retiring neighbors who preferred selling to the Sullivan family rather than developers. The organic beef operation supplied restaurants in 6 states, while the agritourism business brought visitors from across the country who wanted to experience authentic ranch life and learn about sustainable agriculture practices. Emma emerged from the ranch office housed in what had once been David's small study, her hair now touched with silver at the temples, and her face showing the laugh lines that came from years of genuine happiness. She carried a tablet displaying the quarterly financial reports that consistently exceeded their projections, though success had never diminished her attention to practical details that kept the operation running smoothly. The state university wants to establish a research partnership, she announced, settling beside Jake on the wooden bench he'd built on the hilltop specifically for watching their children grow up. They're interested in studying our soil restoration methods and water conservation techniques. Jake nodded approvingly, remembering how David had always dreamed of the ranch contributing to agricultural knowledge rather than simply producing beef. The partnership would provide additional income while allowing them to share techniques that might help other ranchers transition to sustainable practices. Tommy's patient work with the colt demonstrated skills that had been developing since he was Grace's age. The boy possessed an intuitive understanding of horses that reminded Jake of David's natural ability with cattle. More importantly, Tommy showed genuine love for the work rather than simply going through motions to please his parents. Grace scrambled down from the fence and ran toward them with the boundless energy that characterized her approach to everything. Her dark hair flew behind her like a banner, and her face glowed with excitement about something that had captured her attention. "Mama! Dad!" She called breathlessly, using the titles that had become natural for both children despite Tommy's memories of his birth father. "The baby calves are playing a game where they run in circles and jump over each other. Come see." Jake and Emma exchanged amused glances at their daughter's enthusiasm for documenting every activity on the ranch. Grace had inherited Emma's love of learning combined with Jake's appreciation for animal behavior, resulting in a 4-year-old who could identify different breeds of cattle and explain their characteristics to visitors with scientific accuracy. They walked together toward the calving pasture where this year's crop of young cattle displayed the playful behavior that Grace found endlessly fascinating. The sight of healthy animals thriving on land that had once struggled to support half as many cattle provided daily evidence of the transformation they'd accomplished through careful stewardship and hard work. The ranch house itself had been expanded twice to accommodate their growing family and the business demands of the agritourism operation. Guest rooms occupied the second floor that Jake had added 3 years ago, while Emma's office and a conference room took up space in the renovated basement. Despite the changes, the house retained the warmth and character that had made it feel like home from Jake's first desperate night there. Tommy finished with the colt and joined them at the fence, his face flushed with satisfaction at another successful training session. The gelding was responding well to basic commands and showed signs of the gentle temperament that made horses suitable for inexperienced riders who visited the ranch. "He's going to be good with the guests," Tommy reported, unconsciously echoing the business considerations that had become part of daily ranch discussions. Patient but not lazy, responsive but not skittish. Jake felt pride at his son's developing judgment about horses but also awareness that Tommy was growing into responsibilities that would eventually require difficult decisions about his future. The boy showed every sign of wanting to remain on the ranch, but Jake and Emma were determined to ensure he had choices rather than feeling trapped by family expectations. College will expand your options, Jake had told Tommy during one of their man-to-man conversations. Learning about business and agriculture and other subjects will make you a better rancher if that's what you choose, or it will prepare you for something different if your interests change. Tommy had nodded seriously, understanding that education was a gift rather than a requirement to abandon the life he loved. Several neighboring ranchers had sent children to agricultural colleges who returned with knowledge that improved family operations, proving that learning and tradition could complement rather than conflict with each other. Doc Henderson's truck appeared on the ranch road, bringing the veterinarian for her monthly inspection of the breeding program that had become one of the operation's most profitable aspects. Her expertise had been instrumental in developing the genetic lines that produced cattle perfectly suited to organic production, and her visits always included updates on industry developments that might affect their plans. The veterinarian climbed out of her truck with the slightly stiffer movements that age had brought to her work, though her eyes remained sharp and her hands steady when examining animals. She'd become something more than a professional service provider over the years, evolving into a trusted advisor whose opinion influenced major decisions about ranch management. "Good afternoon, Sullivan family," she greeted them with the warmth that characterized all her interactions with people she'd watched grow and prosper over the years. "How's our prize breeding stock performing this season?" "Better than projected," Jake replied, leading her toward the pasture where their registered bulls grazed in well-maintained comfort. "The artificial insemination program has produced calves with exactly the characteristics we were hoping for." Doc Henderson spent an hour examining animals and reviewing breeding records while Grace peppered her with questions about veterinary procedures and animal anatomy. The little girl's scientific curiosity impressed the doctor, who answered even the most complex questions with patience and accuracy that treated Grace as a serious student rather than merely an entertaining child. After the veterinary visit, the family gathered for dinner in the kitchen that remained the heart of their home despite all the changes surrounding it. The table where they ate had been crafted by Jake from wood grown on their own land, while the chairs represented a mixture of family pieces and items they'd acquired as their needs expanded. Emma served a meal featuring beef from their own cattle, vegetables from their expanded garden, and bread made from wheat grown by neighboring farmers who'd joined their cooperative marketing efforts. The food represented the self-sufficiency that had become both philosophy and practical reality at Broken Arrow Ranch. The dinner conversation covered ranch business, school activities, and plans for the upcoming county fair, where Tommy would show cattle and Grace would enter her first competition with a lamb she'd raised from birth. The easy flow of family discussion revealed relationships built on mutual respect and shared interests rather than obligation or duty. After the children were in bed, Jake and Emma sat on their porch swing watching stars emerge in the Montana sky that stretched endlessly above their small island of light and activity. The evening ritual had remained constant through all the changes of the past decade, providing time to process daily events and plan for future challenges. "I received a call today from someone who wants to write a book about our story," Emma mentioned casually, though Jake detected undercurrents of uncertainty in her voice. "A writer who specializes in profiles of successful agricultural operations." Jake considered the implications of such publicity, weighing potential benefits against their family's preference for privacy. Media attention might help other ranchers learn from their experience, but it would also bring scrutiny to their personal lives that could affect the children. "What did you tell them?" he asked, trusting Emma's judgment about matters involving family welfare and business considerations. "That we'd discuss it and get back to them," Emma replied. "I wanted to hear your thoughts before making any commitments about sharing our story publicly." They talked through various aspects of the proposal while the ranch settled into nighttime quiet around them. Cattle moved peacefully in distant pastures, horses stood drowsing in corrals, and the sounds of agricultural life provided a constant background to their conversation. The story the writer wanted to tell was one of transformation and redemption, of love growing from tragedy and success emerging from near disaster. It was also the story of David's continuing influence on their lives, his vision realized through people who'd found in each other the strength to honor the past while building toward the future. I think David would want other people to know that struggling ranchers have options, Emma said eventually. That sustainable practices and diversified operations can save family farms rather than forcing them to sell to developers. Jake agreed with her reasoning, recognizing that sharing their experience might help other families facing similar challenges. The book could serve as both tribute to David's memory and practical guide for ranchers seeking alternatives to conventional agricultural practices that were becoming increasingly difficult to sustain economically. "We'll do it," Jake decided, his arm tightening around Emma as she leaned against his shoulder. But with conditions about protecting the children's privacy and focusing on the ranch operation rather than personal details. Emma nodded, comfortable with the compromise that would allow them to help others while maintaining the family boundaries they'd established over the years. Their story had become something larger than their individual experiences, representing possibilities that other families might realize if they had access to information and encouragement. The conversation drifted to other topics as the evening deepened around them. Plans for expanding the guest facilities, Tommy's development as a horseman, Grace's fascination with ranch management, and the countless small decisions that comprised successful agricultural operations all received attention during their quiet time together. Looking back over the decades since David's death, Jake marveled at the journey that had brought them to this point of stability and contentment. The guilt-ridden hermit who'd lived in isolation had been transformed into a family man whose happiness depended on the welfare of others. The struggling widow who'd faced losing everything had become a successful businesswoman whose expertise was sought by agricultural professionals across the region. Most remarkably, they'd created something that honored David's memory while establishing their own legacy, proving that love could grow from loss and that families could be formed by choice and commitment rather than just biology. The ranch that had seemed doomed now thrived beyond anyone's most optimistic projections, while the family that had been broken by tragedy had been rebuilt stronger and more resilient than before. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities as it always did in agricultural life. But tonight Jake Sullivan felt the deep satisfaction that came from knowing he was exactly where he belonged, surrounded by people he loved and engaged in work that mattered. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, while 3 generations of the Sullivan family slept peacefully under the vast Montana sky, secure in the knowledge that they'd built something worth preserving for the generations yet to come. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.